Hello, we're going to discuss civil rights today, Unit 6, Chapter 5. This is Topic 1. All right, let's talk a little bit about civil rights. Civil rights and civil liberties are often lumped together, but they are different concepts. A civil liberty, we're talking about those rights that are protected for all persons, the rights that all persons should have, and they really discuss the limits placed on a government. All right, they are your preventions of tyranny. Civil rights are the positive acts that a government is going to take to prevent discrimination and provide equality. They're the things that the government is going to design that are going to help to prevent discrimination. When we talk about civil rights in the United States, we have to start off with the issue of slavery, the Civil War, and of course the 14th Amendment. The Civil War ultimately is going to decide the question of supremacy and how much the states need to obey the Constitution and the federal government. Okay. The 14th Amendment is one of the civil rights amendments. Again, the 13th Amendment is going to end slavery. The 14th Amendment is going to provide citizenship and due process protection for the freed slaves. And then finally, the 15th Amendment is going to give them the right to vote. The 14th Amendment creates this idea of dual citizenship. It creates the idea that we are citizens first of the United States, all right, and then second of the state in which they reside. Now, up to this point, a lot of states, particularly in the South, placed state sovereignty, state citizenship above the national government. Again, the Civil War is going to settle the supremacy question, placing the national government at the apex of our system. All right, so when we're looking at civil rights again, after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the 14th Amendment is going to be particularly important here because it is going to be the amendment or addition that the courts are going to take a peek at, that Congress is going to look at as an expansion of protection. And there are two clauses inside the 14th Amendment. Again, one that lays out citizenship protection or citizenship, and the second which is going to provide due process and equal protection under the law for all people, and all is the important part there. All right. The adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment is not going to end discrimination in the United States, and it's going to continue all the way up through and into the 1960s, and we're talking about African Americans in particular here, with the black codes, which are going to be literacy tests and poll taxes, and Jim Crow, which is going to basically enforce legal segregation of schools, public transportation, and hotels. So even though we adopted the 14th Amendment with some really awesome language to protect these newly freed slaves, it's not going to be placed into action or used until we get to the turn of the 20th century. And again, the Plessy-Ferguson case is the key there. All right, two types of discrimination. I just want to mention these because they both were practiced in the United States. De jure discrimination, that's discrimination that's derived from law. And again, the Jim Crow laws are going to be a great example of de jure discrimination. And the other type is de facto discrimination, which is basically just going to evolve from the practice of discrimination. All right, it's just happening in a society. You're discriminated against because, not that it's the law, but it's pretty much, everyone accepts it is the way that things are. Again, you can kind of take a peek at some of those segregation issues there in the Deep South with water fountains, seats at lunch counters. Those are examples of de facto discrimination. All right, when we're talking about civil rights, we're not just talking about civil rights for African Americans. We're talking about civil rights for all persons. And again, civil rights are going to cover all equal protection issues. African American civil rights, other ethnic groups, women, the disabled, and homosexuals are all going to be covered under these civil rights protections. When we look at the civil rights history, here's a brief breakdown here on the slide. The big one there, Plessy-Ferguson, really does establish this idea of separate versus, or separate is equal, and that dealt with trolleys and the fact of whites and blacks mixing on trolley transportation. Then we're going to look at equal executive orders. We have 8802. Where FDR is going to ban discrimination in defense industry and government offices. Executive Order 9981 in 1948, Truman is going to desegregate the armed forces. So we see there not only is it going to be court cases, but also executive orders, which are going to lead the push here for civil rights. As you know, sometimes Congress is a pretty tough place to get things accomplished. So you can see here by the courts and by executive orders, that's how a lot of the heavy moving is going to take place before we get into the 1960s. Everyone's familiar with the Brown versus the Board of Education case. That's the big civil rights case in 1954, which is going to overturn the Plessy-Ferguson case and establish the idea that separate is not equal. Now that's going to be followed up by a case, Brown versus the Board of Education 2 in 1955, and this case is taken by the Supreme Court with simply the idea that things were not moving fast enough, that they needed to put some more pressure on the states in order to desegregate their schools. And you'll see that the Supreme Court ordered these schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And this was met by a lot of resistance, massive resistance by southern states, with the idea that how long it was going to take to desegregate new schools, new busing patterns. But the court put the push on the states to accomplish these changes. All right, the big change here, the revolution in civil rights, is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's going to be a piece of legislation that's going to be rammed through Congress by Lyndon Baines Johnson after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was very frustrated with Congress, and it probably, if he wasn't assassinated, this would not have been passed. But this is the first real piece of legislative action which is going to provide civil rights. And you'll see some of the details there on the slide. It outlaws racial discrimination in public. It prohibited any type of discrimination in employment. It was going to uphold or withhold government funding from schools and institutions that discriminated. It creates the Equal Opportunity Commission, which was going to help monitor job discrimination across the United States. And it also granted the Justice Department power to enforce civil rights laws. So it was going to embolden, again, the executive branch to go out and execute laws passed by Congress. All right, when we look at voting rights, this is another big element of civil rights. The 15th Amendment is going to be passed in 1870, and it's going to give African Americans the right to vote, but it's going to be countered with poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and white primaries, primarily in the South to prevent African American voters from participating. The 24th Amendment will be added in 1964, which outlaws the use of a poll tax where you have to pay to vote. That was going to disappear. And then finally, in 1965, following the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and this prevented states from using methods such as any kind of method, whether it's a grandfather clause, a poll tax, from disenfranchising voters or discouraging voters from participating. All right. It also laid out tougher laws so that the executive branch and the federal government, through the FBI, could go down there and enforce and oversee elections, primarily in the Deep South. All right, we focus on women. The women's civil rights movement really culminates there, and then with the 19th Amendment, with their right to vote. That's a big issue that they had been fighting for a very long time, which had been superseded by abolition, the abolitionist movement. Women are finally going to get the right to vote. In 1963, we have the Equal Pay Act, which is going to make it illegal to base pay on race, gender, religion, or origin. The Civil Rights Act is also going to help out women because it prohibits employment discrimination. And Title IX, passed in 1972, is going to prevent gender discrimination by institutions. All right, so colleges and universities that receive federal funds could no longer discriminate against women. This has brought up some real interesting questions and some changes in terms of collegiate athletics, whereas colleges have to have the same number as male and female sports programs, the same number of available scholarships. And Title IX really levels the playing field in terms of men's and women's athletics. All right, civil rights also cover people with disabilities. The Rehabilitation Act back in '73 prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities involved in any federal program. We protected handicapped children in 1975. And the big one here in 1990, which we've talked about a few times in class, is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which really absolutely forbids employers for basically not making reasonable accommodations to employ people with disabilities. Okay? It also opens the door for all public facilities, buildings, to have handicapped access. Finally, when we talk about civil rights, we have affirmative action. Affirmative action is the idea where we're basically going to correct the effects or impact of past discrimination on different races, on women, on the handicapped, and we're going to try to make up for it. Okay? Most of the time when we're trying to make up for these past abuses, it's going to deal with issues of race or gender. A lot of the time we talk about affirmative action, we're talking about job access, and more importantly, we're talking about education, schools, university admission. All right, thanks for this quick video, watching this quick video on civil rights. Make sure to do the Google form and read Chapter 5.